So today I'm fortunate enough to have the president of the Negro League Baseball Museum, Bob Kendrick, as a guest today. Mr. Kendrick, how are you?
Tim, I'm doing great, man. How are you?
Good, good. So I'd like to start off talking about Buck O'Neil, who's being inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown this summer, which is long overdue. And just what does it mean for you and those who were impacted by Buck O'Neil that his legacy is now being immortalized in Cooperstown?
Well, honestly, Tim, I haven't stopped smiling since Sunday, December 5th, around 5:30 Central Standard Time, when my friend Josh Raywich over at the National Baseball Hall of Fame uh, announced that Buck O'Neil had gotten enough votes to go into the National Baseball Hall of Fame. And so I've been smiling ever since. We're all excited. Any of us who knew Buck, or those who may not have known him but know his story, feel very passionately that he deserves to be in the National Baseball Hall of Fame. It may have hit a little harder for me because I was with him in 2006 and had to deliver the news to him that he didn't get enough votes to get in. He missed by one vote in 2006. And of course, that set off a tidal wave of anger amongst baseball fans worldwide. Who handled it better than anyone? Buck O'Neil. And so it's almost poetic justice that 15 years later, he finally gets voted in. And I'm excited in anticipation to get to Cooperstown and be there on July 24th when he finally takes his rightful place amongst the immortals of our game. So not only am I excited, but our entire team. And I really do think the baseball world is excited about Buck O'Neil's induction.
I mean, that's great. It's definitely been long overdue. So for like the students who will be listening to this, and maybe like people from like my parents' generation who will be listening,
Uh-huh.
who might not know what Buck O'Neil did for baseball, can you elaborate on how important he is to the game?
Oh, Buck checks virtually every box of accomplishment in this game. He had been a great player himself, joining the Negro Leagues in 1937 with the Memphis Red Sox. He would be moved over to Kansas City in a brilliantly orchestrated trade by Kansas City Monarchs owner J.L. Wilkerson, who brought Buck over to the Monarchs in 1938, and that began an affiliation with the Monarchs as a great first baseman, player, manager for the Monarchs through the end of the 1955 season. He would leave the Monarchs to go become a scout for the Chicago Cubs. And as a scout, Buck O'Neil signed Hall of Famers Ernie Banks and Lou Brock and Lee Arthur Smith to their first professional contracts with the Cubs. Hopefully, future Hall of Famer and my dear friend Joe Carter, also to the Cubs. And then Buck broke barriers himself, Tim, by becoming the major's first African American coach in baseball history in 1962 with the Cubs. And then, of course, becoming the great ambassador as he was for this game. And you could make a case for him and the work that he did in building the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, that alone would have merited his consideration for the Hall of Fame. But when you put all of his contributions together over 7 decades of significant impact on this game, you'd be hard pressed to find anyone who gave the game more than Buck O'Neil did.
That's awesome. I understand there's also a few other players who have connection to the Negro Leagues being inducted this year, such as Bud Fowler.
Yes, yes, but Bud Fowler, who is on record as the first known black baseball player. And coincidentally, he grew up in Cooperstown, New York. So how poetic is that?
That's
And
awesome.
of course, my dear friend, the great Minnie Minoso, who was on the ballot with Buck in 2006. Matter of fact, they were the only two living names on the ballot in 2006 when 17 Negro Leaguers did get in, but both Buck and the great Minnie Minoso were left out. And I'm really overjoyed that Minnie Minoso is also getting his rightful place in the National Baseball Hall of Fame. For those who may not be familiar with the name Minnie Minoso was really the Afro-Latino Jackie Robinson. He opened the door for Afro-Latino baseball players in a similar fashion in which Jackie Robinson did for American-born blacks. And Manny Minoso was a superstar, originally signed by the Cleveland Indians, never took the field with the Indians, and then was traded over to the Chicago White Sox, becoming the first black player to play for the White Sox. And as I tell people all the time, Manny Minoso put the GO in what was called then the Go-Go White Sox. Dynamic player, 5'2" guy, hit for power, hit for average, could field, could run, could throw, and he became a fan favorite. And so it is absolutely long overdue for Manny Minoso that he too takes his place in the National Baseball Hall of Fame.
And then, are there any players who aren't in Cooperstown yet who you think deserve to be inducted soon?
Oh yeah, no, there are still any number, Tim, of great players. While we're proud of the number of players from the Negro Leagues who are now recognized by the National Baseball Hall of Fame, we certainly understand that there is still a litany of other great players who deserve to be in the Hall of Fame. It is our job to continue to advocate and help make people aware of stars like the great John Donaldson. John Donaldson was on the list for consideration in 2021. And honestly, I was heartbroken that he didn't get in. John Donaldson is one of the greatest pitchers in baseball history. Over 400 verifiable wins, over 5,000 verifiable strikeouts. So his feats were almost unbelievable, but they're true and they're very real as they have been researched and documented and substantiated. He's just one, Vicious Vic Harris, who was a standout for the Homestead Grays and then later managed some of the greatest teams in baseball history with the Homestead Grays. Dynamic baseball player, Tubby Scales. These guys were all on the ballot. They all could have very easily earned consideration for the Hall of Fame. And so, yeah, there's still guys like Dick Lundy. The list goes on and on. I believe Ted Double Duty Ratcliffe, one of the most colorful characters in all of baseball, earned his nickname Double Duty when the great sports writer Damon Runyon saw Duty catch a Satchel Paige shutout in the first game of a doubleheader, took off the catcher's gear, took the mound, and threw a shutout in the second game of the doubleheader and said he was worth the price of 2 admissions. He was nicknamed Double Duty from that day on. He died at age 103 in Chicago in 2005. And another guy who I think certainly merits strong consideration for the National Baseball Hall of Fame.
And to switch gears a little bit, who are your favorite players in the game of baseball today?
There are a lot of guys that I enjoy watching. I just had Mookie Betts and Tim Anderson on my podcast. I do a podcast called Black Diamonds that we do with Sirius XM Radio. And so I just had Mookie and Tim, and those are two of my favorite guys to watch play. Both have been here to the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. They are throwbacks to the way that the game was played in the Negro Leagues. They're very exciting, dynamic, multi-talented kinds of athletes who bring, I think, a lot of energy and passion to the game. They truly embody the spirit of the Negro Leagues. Like most, I love Shohei Ohtani because what Shohei Ohtani did, Tim, he gave me an opportunity to talk about the great two-way stars of the Negro Leagues. Everybody was obviously enamored with what he was able to do. One of the most amazing seasons we've seen in recent years in Major League Baseball with this two-way star who was pitching and then playing a position as well. Well, that was commonplace in the Negro Leagues. But I got to tip my cap to Shohei Ohtani because all of the excitement around what he was doing led people to us to want to learn about the great two-way stars of the Negro Leagues. See, Negro League rosters were not as large as Major League rosters. So you really did need athletes who could offer versatility. So you really could not afford to have a 4 or 5 man dedicated pitching rotation. And so most of the pitchers in the Negro Leagues were also great everyday players. But there were some exceptional guys who fulfilled both roles at levels that really we've never seen before. The first one that comes to mind for me is the legendary Wilbur Bullet Joe Rogan. Rogan was amazing. When Bullet Rogan wasn't pitching, he hit cleanup in the Kansas City Monarchs lineup and played the outfield. Now, let me tell you, you don't just hit cleanup in any Kansas City Monarch lineup because the Monarchs were so consistently good. You know, he was a perennial 20-game winner kind of stuff. He had a lifetime batting average over 300. He led the Negro Leagues in stolen bases when he was 38 years old. He pitched with a no wind-up delivery, if you can imagine that. And yet his nickname was Bullet. Yeah, that ball just seemed to fire out his hands, man. And so, no, he was special, but the same could be said for Leon Day, Ray Brown. We talked about Ted Double Duty Radcliffe, Martin DeHigo, the great Cuban star, who not only was two-way, he played every position on the diamond and was good at every one of them, including pitching and catching. He was a special kind of ball player. But those are just a few of the guys that I really enjoy watching. Mike Trout, of course, a phenomenal baseball player. And so I enjoy getting a chance to watch these guys play.
I've actually been listening to your podcast, Black Diamonds, and a brief story you told for one of your episodes was about how Joe Louis helped Jackie Robinson in his journey
Yeah,
to Major League Baseball.
yeah.
As someone who's just like a massive fan of both the history of boxing and baseball, can you like share that story with our listeners?
Well, number one, Joe Louis was a huge baseball fan. But like most people of that era, they were baseball fans because baseball was the sport. Well, coincidentally, Joe Louis and Jackie Robinson were both stationed at little bitty Fort Riley, right up the road from the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum in Fort Riley, Kansas. But at that time, Joe Louis was the star. You know, to be the heavyweight boxing champion of the world or the fastest man in the world were really the two most prestigious sports titles that anyone could hold in this country during that era. And so Jackie Robinson had more than enough qualification to be in officer school at Fort Riley, along with some other black enlistees there. But Fort Riley was not admitting blacks into its officer school program. Joe Louis and others protested. And Joe Louis, who had been doing exhibition prize fights to raise money for the military, called in some favors. And that's how he helps get his friend Jackie Robinson into officer school. Well, once Jackie gets into officer school, he's now transferred to Fort Hood in Texas. And that is where he was seen playing military ball by another legendary monarch by the name of Hilton Smith. Hilton Smith had initially recommended Jackie Robinson to Monarch's owner, J.L. Wilkinson. And then in 1945, Jackie writes to Wilkinson and asks for a tryout. They try him out in Houston, Texas, and Jackie makes the team. And as I mentioned in the podcast, little did Monarchs owner J.O. Wilkinson know that he had just signed a man that was going to put him out of business because by the end of that 1945 season, Jackie was gone. And ultimately, he was meeting, of course, with Branch Rickey, and the two of them make that monumental decision that Jackie would become the chosen one to break Major League Baseball's 6-decade-long self-imposed color barrier, but that also would signal the death knell of the Negro Leagues because as these other black and brown players now were able to move in to Major League Baseball, there was no replenishing system for the Negro Leagues, so the Negro Leagues would essentially and eventually dissolve.
That's an awesome story. And then one thing I did hear on Black Diamonds was the Barrier Breakers exhibit, which is at
Yes,
Dodger Stadium, which
yes.
featured players from Jackie Robinson to Pumpsie Green. I want to know how long is it, and like will it be like a touring thing moving forward, or is it just at Dodger Stadium?
Now we set it up to be a touring exhibit. And Dodger Stadium is the first stop of what we hope will be a multi-year national tour of this exhibit because we think it's very important. We timed this, of course, Tim, to go with the 75th anniversary of Jackie's breaking of the color barrier. 75 years ago, he takes that monumental walk on the field as a member of the Brooklyn Dodgers, forever changing the game of baseball, but more importantly, forever changing this country for the better. And so we wanted to time the release of the exhibit, and what a perfect place for this exhibit to debut Dodger Stadium, given the connection that Jackie had, of course, to the Brooklyn Dodgers before they moved out to Los Angeles. And this exhibit, as you mentioned, chronicles all of the players. I see your Boston Red Sox cap, and the
Yep.
Red Sox were the last team to integrate in 1959 when
Yep.
they signed a player by the name of Elijah Ponce Green. That completed the integration cycle. But as we so oftentimes do in our society, we always celebrate the first. We rarely ever remember the second guy. And if you're number 16, you can pretty well forget it. And so Larry Doby would integrate the American League literally weeks after Jackie breaks the color barrier in the National League, and he's almost an afterthought. It has only been over the last decade or so that people have finally started to pay proper tribute to Larry Doby's pioneering role. Even more so, there were 5 guys who go up in 1947. And they have become essentially the answer to a trivia question. So we know about Jackie, and perhaps a few more now know about Larry Doby. But Hank Thompson, Willard Brown, and Dan Bankhead all go up in 1947. Hank Thompson and Willard Brown and Jackie Robinson all come from the great Kansas City Monarchs. And of course, Larry Doby was playing for the Newark Eagles, and Dan Bankhead was, I believe, at that time playing in Birmingham when he gets called up. And so it's a fascinating story that shines light on all of baseball's integration pioneers, and is long overdue. But as we oftentimes say here, if we don't tell those stories, who will? And it's important that we do, because the moral majority, Tim, of the players who broke the color barrier over that 12-year time span, they were all Negro League players. There were only a handful that weren't, but the moral majority of them were Negro League players. And I think it speaks again to the immense talent that was there in the Negro Leagues. And so you can see why, as the Negro League started to lose its young black stars, black and brown stars, there was no replenishing system in place. And so the leagues dissolved.
And then one of the episodes, or several episodes, you talk about barnstorming, which I find
Yeah.
very interesting. So for those who aren't aware, can you talk about what barnstorming was?
Well, in a baseball context, it just simply means they were taking professional baseball, to towns and parts of the globe that may not have seen this kind of brand of baseball. And because Major League Baseball, you have to remember, was isolated pretty much east of the Mississippi River. And the Negro Leagues didn't go any further west than Kansas City. Major League Baseball no further west than St. Louis. And so if you live on the western foremost half of the country, this is how you got to see professional baseball, through barnstormers. And the Negro Leaguers were heralded barnstormers. So they took their brand of professional baseball into Canada. They were oftentimes the first Americans to play in many Spanish-speaking countries. As we talk about it, here was a touring team of Negro Leaguers that would go to Japan in 1927 and introduce that brand of professional baseball to the Japanese. This is years before Babe Ruth and his All-Stars go to Japan. They have been credited with having basically introduced professional baseball to the Japanese, but it's not true. It was a team called the Philadelphia Royal Giants who go to Japan in 1927, play a 24-game exhibition series. They go 23-0-1 on the tour. The tour was so successful that several years later, Babe Ruth and his All-Stars would visit Japan. And as I always preface that with our visitors, as you look at our game today in a global capacity, there are so many ethnicities that make up a major league roster on any given day. But at the heart of it were the Negro Leagues. They helped make the game the global game that it is today. They just never got credit for it. And so barnstorming plays a prevalent role because there were so many people, and the Kansas City Monarchs were one of the great barnstorming teams. You can hear stories of people from all parts of this country talk about remembering seeing the Monarchs come into their town. As a matter of fact, there was once a newspaper headline that said the Kansas City Monarchs were the talk of the town all over the world.
So do you think barnstorming is something that should come back to promote the game of baseball?
I think it would be interesting if baseball were to implement some of those models that were so prevalent in its early era. Even when Jackie breaks the color barrier, he would put together these black all-star teams, and they were obviously trying to make more money. So, the guys don't have to do that now in the off season because they make a lot of money. But they would put together these barnstorming exhibition tours and go into all parts of the country where Major League Baseball wasn't set up. And of course, the Negro Leaguers were always doing that. So not only did it promote the game, it absolutely promoted the game, I should say, and it heightened the interest, but it gave fans who otherwise would not have an opportunity to see these amazing athletes play the chance to do so. And I think it helped grow the sport as a result of. So it wouldn't necessarily be a bad idea. That's why I think one of the greatest things that Major League Baseball ever did was the creation of the World Baseball Classic. Yeah. And when you see the energy and excitement from those other countries around this game and the pride that they have, for this game, and to me, it is one of the greatest showcase baseball experience ever is the World Baseball Classic.
I agree. And then, as someone who's always been a massive fan of the art of pitching, I need to know how good Satchel Paige really was. So I've heard a few stories. I read a book on him when I was like a little kid. Uh, but is he really the greatest pitcher who ever lived?
Certainly, in my humble estimation, he is. Because what you'll hear oftentimes, particularly as it relates to his Negro Leagues chapter of this story, you'll hear somebody say, well, such and such threw as hard as Satchel, or such and such was as good as Satchel. But when you're the measuring stick, when you are the standard that everybody else is comparing to, you must be pretty doggone special. Yeah. But Satchel, to me, what separated him from everybody else, because there just likely were guys who threw as hard as Satchel. And maybe their stuff was as good as Satchel. They may check one or two boxes. But when you look at Satchel and you look at the longevity, when you look at the great stuff, and then you look at the charisma, he was the premier gate attraction. Everybody wanted to see Satchel. So Satchel had superstardom written all over him. And it's not everybody that checks all three boxes. And to me, that's what sets Satchel aside. When I used to talk to the late, great Buck O'Neil, and he'd say, the Kansas City Monarchs were always a good baseball team. When Satchel was on the mound, they were a great baseball team. But what happens when Satchel's on the mound? Satchel brought out the best in the other guy because you want to make a name. And how do you make a name? Beat Satchel Paige. And so, that is to me what separates Satchel from everybody else. Not only did he raise the game of his teammates, he raised the game of the opposition. And so that was how they could make their mark. But, when you combine all three, longevity, great stuff, charisma, now there won't ever be another Leroy Satchel Paige.
And then I also heard on your podcast that he faced Willie Mays, who, in my opinion, is one of the three players that you can argue is the greatest Major League Baseball player ever.
Yes.
I personally think he is. But what was that at bat like, and like who came out the victor?
Well, I heard this story from the horse's mouth, Willie Mays. I'm in San Francisco with my friend Brian Murphy, the great radio personality out there, sports talk radio personality. And Brian had arranged for me to have a private moment with Mr. Mays at the ballpark. And so we're in the player's garage and we're standing chatting. And Brian asked me, he said, well, Willie, did you ever face Satchel Paige? And Mr. Mays is feeling pretty good this day and he lights up like a Christmas tree. And if you've heard him talk, he kind of has a high-pitched voice. And he said, yeah, I faced Satchel. I faced Satchel when I was 17 years old. The first time I faced Satchel, I got a double off of him. Well, the old man didn't know who this kid was. He grooves one. Mays hits it in the gap. He gets a double. Satchel tells the third baseman, say, hey, let me know when he comes back up. Couple innings later, here comes young Willie Mays in the batter's box. The third baseman said, hey, Satchel, there he is. And Satchel says, I ain't gonna try to trick you, son. I'm gonna throw you three fastballs. And Mr. Mays saying to himself, you gonna throw me three fastballs? He says, Satchel threw three straight right by me. I never saw him. And when I was turning to walk back to the dugout, Satchel says, now go sit down, little boy. And here is arguably the greatest major leaguer of all time, simply delighting being remembered being struck out by Satchel Paige. That tells you how special Satchel Paige was. And both were, of course, from Alabama. Willie from that Birmingham area and Satchel from Mobile, which I don't know what they put in the water in Mobile, but there are a lot of great players who came out of that Mobile area.
And then another question I have for you is it's kind of a debate among my friends. Who do you think is better, Willie Mays or Hank Aaron?
Ooh, man. Oh, that's like that's 1A, 1B. But and I let me preface this by saying I'm biased. Henry Aaron is my all-time favorite baseball player and my childhood idol as a kid growing up in Crawfordville, Georgia, about 80 miles east of Atlanta, 50 miles west of Augusta. So anytime that I was on the playground, I wanted to be Henry Aaron. And so for me, in a game of numbers, and baseball is just that, a game of numbers, no one's numbers are better than Henry Aaron. But Mr. Aaron didn't play the game with the same kind of flamboyancy that Willie did. And of course, he played in Atlanta. Willie's in San Francisco. Willie could have very easily broken the home run record if he doesn't give up time to service. And so the debate still rages on today on which were better. I'm just proud that both of them came out of the Negro Leagues. Willie Mays, as I mentioned, 17 years old, patrolling center field for the Birmingham Black Barons. Henry Aaron was 18 years old when he joined the Indianapolis Clowns in 1952 as a skinny, cross-handed hitting infielder. And so we're talking about arguably, certainly in everybody's top five greatest players of all time, and both come out of the Negro League. But I'm biased, so I have to lean toward my guy, Henry Aaron. But I don't want Mr. Mays to know I just said that.
Yeah, in my opinion, those are two of the three guys you could argue as the greatest major leaguers of all time. I put Ted Williams in that conversation too, but
Yeah, yeah.
like my dad was growing up, he was a massive Hank Aaron fan.
Oh,
We
yeah.
we actually lucky enough to have a Hank Aaron bat. Um,
Okay.
and then once I read Willie Mays' book, I became like a huge fan. I've always been interested in baseball history. But just the thing where he was talking about how he used to be able to cover both foul lines was one of the craziest things I think I've ever
And,
heard.
and while he possessed great physical tools, his greatest asset really was his mind. Willie Mays was an astute student of the game. He knew all the nuances. He knew what players' weaknesses and their strengths were, and he was dazzling. But he did everything with a flair. And there was always like a ooh whenever Willie did anything. And he played the glamour position center field. Mr. Aaron played a corner outfield, and so Mr. Aaron probably always felt like he never got enough credit for how great a defensive player he really was because he made it look so easy. But he too was a student of the game. He studied, and so he knew where guys were likely to hit the ball, and he always got great jumps on the ball, and he always made the right play. Throwing to the right base, doing all the little things that sometimes don't get noticed, but they help you win ball games. And both of those guys brought that to the table as well.
I mean, yeah, like I said, I think the Mays, Aaron, and Williams were the three players that stand out to me when you talk about who the greatest could be. But after reading Willie Mays' book, which I think like everyone should read, Um, I I have to say I think he's the greatest of all time.
It would be hard to get too much argument. Now, there was a player in the Negro League by the name of Oscar Charleston, whom my friend Buck O'Neill would say without hesitation, the greatest baseball player he ever saw. He joins you in thinking that Willie Mays was the greatest major leaguer. And because, again, Willie could do everything. He was a consummate power tool guy as well. Willie could beat you every way in which you could be beaten, with his bat, with his arm, with his glove, with his legs. Oscar Charleston was an early era Negro leaguer who the old timers in the Negro League say the closest thing to Oscar Charleston would have been Willie Mays. And that's scary to think, man. Oscar Charleston in 1921 led the Negro Leagues in home runs, triples, doubles, stolen bases, and batting average in the same season. He had, if you are a fan of the history of our sport, he had the defensive abilities of Tris Speaker, the tenacity of Ty Cobb. He'd fight you. Now, he usually wouldn't start the fight, but he sure would end the fight. And he had the power of Babe Ruth rolled into one dynamic package. And Buck says he never saw a center fielder, including Mays, who could go back on a ball the way Charleston could. He just had uncanny instincts to him. He seemed to always know where that ball was coming down right off the crack of the bat. I'm sure you and I'm sure your other colleagues, they've probably all likely seen the video of Mr. Mays making the dazzling over-the-shoulder catch in the World Series. And I remind people all the time, the throw was actually better than the catch. But because the magnitude of the moment, and because he had to literally run a country mile to make that catch, over the shoulder basket catch, people just remember that moment in time. Well, all the old timers in the Negro League say, had that been Oscar Charleston, he'd have been waiting for that ball to come down, man.
And one thing I wasn't aware of until very recently was how many like Cuban stars were in the Negro Leagues.
Yeah.
Uh, can you talk about that a little bit? Because it's something I've been trying to listen to your episode on it on Black Diamonds, but
Yeah.
due to finishing up finals and everything, been unable to finish it yet. But I can't wait to get through it. But do you have any like stories to share about the Cuban stars in the Negro
Oh, yeah.
Leagues?
No, I mean, we talked about one when I talked about the two-way players, the great Martin Dihigo, who hailed from Cuba. His nickname was El Maestro, the master, because he could do it all. Played all 9 positions, as I mentioned, played all 9 of them well. He is the only baseball player in the history of our sport to be enshrined into 5 different countries' baseball halls of fame. He's in the Mexican, Cuban, Venezuelan, Dominican, and in Cooperstown. Tim, one year in the Mexican, 1 year in the Mexican League, Dihigo wins the pitching title. He goes 19-2 with an 0.90 ERA. The sucker hits 387 that same season and won the batting title. One of the most rarest double-doubles you will ever see in this game. I have to tell you now, I don't think we'll ever see that again. A guy win the pitching title and win the batting title. And that's how impressive Martin Dihigo was. Stood about 6'3", 6'4", movie star good looks. He too had superstardom written all over him, an arm that many say was just as good, if not better, than Roberto Clemente, who people obviously fell in love with, and rightfully so. Roberto Clemente, one of the greatest baseball players of all time, who hailed, of course, from Puerto Rico. But then there were other great stars like Jose Mendez, the Black Diamond, who was a great player in the Negro Leagues. Silvio Garcia, also from Cuba. Cristobal Torriente, another player from Cuba who's in the National Baseball Hall of Fame. Louis Tiant, his father, El Tiante Sr., starred in the Negro Leagues with the New York Cubans. and many believe that he was better than Junior, and Junior, who I absolutely adore, should be in the National Baseball Hall of Fame. It
I
is a
agree.
travesty that Louis Tiant Jr. is not in the National Baseball Hall of Fame. And there are those who say that his father was better than he was. So, just a sampling of the great Cuban stars and those Negro League players who would go to those Spanish speaking countries. They would go down to Cuba. They would go to Puerto Rico, Venezuela, the Dominican Republic, Mexico. And when we went to those countries, we were welcomed with open arms. So now we're staying in the finest hotels. We're eating in the finest restaurants that those countries have to offer. And man, you come back home and now you're treated like a second class citizen. And that was part of the reason that a number of Negro League players would call those Spanish speaking countries home for one simple reason. In those countries, we weren't black baseball players. We were just baseball players. That's all they ever wanted to be.
Yeah, and just to go back to like Tiant real quick, because I've actually written an article on how Louis Tiant should be in the Baseball Hall of Fame, and he actually read it, which was awesome.
That's cool. He's
Yeah,
such a fun-loving guy.
yeah,
I
I've
love
got to
him to
meet him a
death.
couple times. Like he's a great person, and and I did want to ask you how good Louis Tiant Sr. was, and it's incredible that he was even like better than his dad. I mean,
Yeah,
not better than his son, but
yeah. No, a lot of people certainly believe that. And see, people remember El Tiante mostly by the time he gets to Boston. When he's with Cleveland, when he first comes into the major leagues with Cleveland, El Tiante threw as hard as anybody in this game. He had electric stuff. By the time he gets to you guys with Boston, he had hurt his arm and he had to reinvent himself. And of course, he had that kind of crazy herky jerky motion. I told him, I said, do you realize how many kids you got hit? Because we were all trying to emulate the way he turned his back and throw and drill so many kids trying to do that. But no, his dad had electric stuff, had great command, and was a fierce competitor, just like Junior. So they're cut from the same cloth. There's no question about that. And so, again, one of the great father-son pitching duos in baseball history that really no one talks about, from that standpoint.
yeah, I mean, I think there should be a huge push for both of them to be inducted into the Hall of Fame soon. Um, I've heard Louis Tiant say over the years that he doesn't really want his family to go if he's not here anymore when he gets inducted to the Baseball Hall of Fame. But
And what a travesty that would be.
I know.
So I'm happy this year that my friend Tony Oliva, we talked about Buck and obviously Minnie Minoso from Cuba as well, the great Minnie Minoso who is going in this year, but Tony Oliva, also a fellow Cuban, who's a dear friend of mine in this museum. I'm thrilled that he is finally going in. Tony Oliva hit over 300 for his career. You don't see too many 300 hitters who are not in the Hall of Fame that it took so long. Yeah, his career wasn't as long as maybe some would have liked it to be. The injuries certainly took its toll. But what he accomplished during that window of time that he was playing was absolutely Hall of Fame worthy. And I'm glad that it is happening while he is still with us. And that's what makes it so meaningful. It goes back to us talking about Buck O'Neill getting in. And obviously, I'm excited that he's getting in, but it's bittersweet because I wish he was here to be a part of this ceremony, to be there so that we can hug our guy and chest bump and high five. We don't get to do that, but it still doesn't diminish the moment, the accomplishment, and hopefully the impact that it will have on this museum.
Do you think there should be like a slight change to the like voting process for these situations like not to happen and these guys to be able to get into the Hall of Fame while they're still here?
Yeah, it's always going to be challenging, because again, you've got a committee that are ultimately making these decisions. And, it's hard to do anything by committee and particularly try to get a consensus. And particularly when the process only allows you to vote for X number of players. So when you've got a list, let's say, for instance, of 10, but you can only vote for 3, even though all 10 might be deserving of being in the Hall of Fame, they have no shot. Or you'll be in a situation where the committee will be splintered and no one gets in because the votes are so, you know, dispersed, and so no one gets in. So it's a lot of things that factor into how this process works that, sometimes makes it difficult for guys who we all believe deserve to be in to get in.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big advocate on my website that there needs to be some accommodations to be made for a lot of these guys to get in. Especially like I even wrote about Tony Oliva and how even though his career was short, how he was definitely a Hall of Fame caliber player. And I know longevity is very important in the game of baseball and to be good for a long amount of time. But some circumstances such as injuries where like it's kind of out of the player's control really should be considered as well.
Yep.
Um, and then another question I have for you is about Josh Gibson, who's without a doubt the best power hitter of any baseball player. So where do you think he ranks in your opinion among the greatest players to ever live?
When people ask me that question, when I think about Josh, I honestly think you can make a legitimate case that Josh Gibson was the greatest baseball player of all time. You don't see that distinction going to catchers. But as you know, it is the most difficult position to play. It is the most physical, demanding position to play. And Josh Gibson, as I remind people, wasn't a good catcher. He was a great catcher. Rifle arm. He's throwing guys out from the crouch back in that era. As Buck O'Neil would say, he had complete control of his pitching staff. So he called a great game. He was a good running catcher. He won't steal you 20, 25 bases or more to go with that big bat of his. And Tim, as I always tell people, when I say big bat, I mean big bat. 40-ounce, 41 inches. You know you got to be a man to swing that kind of lumber.
Yeah.
And when you see the pictures of Josh, he ain't choking up. He got it gripped down below the knob. Big, powerful forearms, big, powerful thighs, as Buck would say, broad chest, knee in the waist, great eyes. Unlike most power hitters who are free swingers, who strike out a lot, Josh didn't. And he just seemed to put the ball in play and put it in play with a lot of power. But we're talking about a guy who had a lifetime batting average of 354. And in head-to-head competition in countless exhibition games against major leaguers, hit over 420. And he was doing this as a catcher. And I can tell you now, it is no coincidence that everywhere Josh played, his teams won. And everywhere that Josh played, he hit. Yeah, he hit. I don't care where it was in the Negro Leagues, in against the major leaguers, in Cuba, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic. It did not matter. He lit everybody up.
Is he in the National Baseball Hall of Fame?
He is. He is. Satchel was the first from the Negro Leagues to go into the National Baseball Hall of Fame in 1971. And then that started a sequence of Negro Leaguers going in. Josh would go in along with his Homestead Grays teammate, the great Buck Leonard, in 1972. And so he is rightfully enshrined in the National Baseball Hall of Fame. And it was your guy, Ted Williams, who I think if you were going to single out anyone who would be responsible for Negro League players getting in the Hall of Fame, it was the great Ted Williams who used his own induction ceremony in 1966 to make a bold statement that he hoped someday the likes of Satchel Paige and Josh Gibson would be voted into the National Baseball Hall of Fame as symbols of those great black stars who weren't there because they'd never been given an opportunity. 5 years later, Satchel becomes the first from the Negro Leagues to be inducted into the National Baseball Hall of Fame. Jackie, of course, while he played in the Negro Leagues, he went into the Hall of Fame for his major league career. Mm-hmm.
And then a couple I have a couple of final questions for you. So if you could see any moment throughout the Negro Leagues or any team throughout their history, what would you choose?
I would love to see the 1931 Homestead Grays, who a lot of historians and researchers believe is the greatest baseball team ever assembled. But if I had to go and look at one moment, I would have loved to have seen this showdown between Satchel and Josh Gibson that took place in the 1942 Negro League World Series. That my friend Buck O'Neill tells the amazing story of Satchel walking the bases loaded to face Gibson and striking him out on 3 pitches after telling him what he was going to throw him. I think that would have been one of the most incredible sports moments ever. And I think it is one of the most incredible sports moments. It would have been amazing to be there to witness it, however.
And then my final question is, if you could have a conversation with one historic player throughout baseball history, who would it be?
Ooh, wow. I've been blessed in this job because I've got a chance to meet my childhood idol, Henry Aaron, and I got to meet the likes of Willie Mays and so many of the other great contemporary baseball players. But I would love to sit down with the great Andrew Rube Foster. Rube Foster, of course, started the Negro Leagues in 1920. And I think Rube Foster is one of, if not the most influential figure in baseball history, even though people don't necessarily know who he was. Rube Foster would have checked the box for Hall of Fame induction in 3 categories. He was a Hall of Fame player himself, a great pitcher in the early era of black baseball. Is credited with having invented what we now know to be the screwball. Back then, they called it a fadeaway. He would have gone in the Hall of Fame as a manager, a great strategist, tactician, preached a brand of baseball that I think we sorely miss today. Was fast, aggressive, daring. They bunt their way on. They still second. They still third. And Tim, if you weren't too smart, they were stealing home. And that's the brand that Foster preached. And again, his influence having established the Negro Leagues here in Kansas City in 1920 and what that did for providing an organized platform for both black and brown players to showcase their world-class baseball abilities. And it was really the mechanism that would ultimately lead us to the integration of this game. So Rube Foster would be someone who I would absolutely love to sit down. He was masterful. I believe that he is the greatest baseball mind this sport has ever seen, and no one knows who he is, even though he is rightfully in the National Baseball Hall of Fame. But yeah, I'd love to sit down and have dinner and chop it up with Rube Foster.
Mr. Kendrick, thank you so much for your time. I greatly appreciate it. I mean, this is definitely the best final college assignment I think I've ever had.
Well, we'll see what the grade is before you.
It still is. It still is. It's
And
definitely
no
worth
matter
it.
what, and no matter what, I appreciate it, man.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it and everything what you do for the game of baseball.
Okay, you're welcome.
All right, have a good one.
Okay, see ya.